Before he set foot in America, he was already a ghost in Moscow, moving through shadows, commanding respect without a word. But when Vyacheslav Yaponchik Ivankov arrived in Brighton Beach, the rules changed, and so did the game. Tonight, we follow the quietest, deadliest man you've never heard of, as power traveled in suitcases, and silence spoke louder than bullets. Moscow's streets were cold, not just in temperature but in spirit. The winter fog rolled over cracked pavements, curling around street lamps that flickered like dying candles. Somewhere in the distance, a train clattered across iron rails, echoing through the alleyways, but the sound was faint compared to the silence that hung over the city's underworld. In these alleys, survival wasn't about strength or numbers, it was about being invisible, being quiet, and knowing exactly when to strike. Vyacheslav Ivankov moved like that, a ghost among men. At first glance, he seemed unremarkable, a man of average height, dressed in a dark wool coat, hat pulled low over his forehead. But anyone who looked closer would notice the calculation in his eyes, the way he observed the world as if it were a chessboard. Nothing escaped him. Every whisper, every glance, every subtle shift in posture told a story, and Ivankov had learned to read them all. He walked past a group of men leaning against a brick wall, cigarette smoke curling around their faces. They were laughing loudly, playing their usual game of bravado and threats. But Ivankov didn't stop, didn't nod, didn't even acknowledge them. They barely noticed him. And that was exactly how he wanted it. In the world he navigated, drawing attention was a mistake, a dangerous one. Ghosts were meant to be unseen, to leave no trace. And he was the most careful of them all. Behind him, the distant chime of church bells rang, an ironic soundtrack for a city built on secrets and survival. Ivankov's mind was already working, calculating, predicting. Each step, each interaction in this city of shadows required precision. The slightest misstep could land a man in a prison cell or worse. He had seen men fall for far less, swallowed by the very streets they thought they knew. Yet, despite the cold, despite the constant tension, Ivankov moved with a kind of calm certainty. There was power in restraint. There was control in silence. He didn't shout. He didn't fight unless absolutely necessary. In a place where men measured respect in fear and reputation, Ivankov wielded something far more dangerous: invisibility paired with intellect. He let others expose themselves first, speak first, make the mistakes, while he observed from the edges. Tonight, though, something felt different. The fog seemed heavier, the streets quieter. Even the distant train clatter had softened, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Ivankov's instincts, honed from years surviving Moscow's prison cells and underground dealings, whispered that change was coming. A storm was approaching, though not the kind carried by wind or snow. This was a storm of human ambition, greed, and shifting alliances. And he intended to survive it all. As he passed an abandoned storefront, a shadow moved in the corner of his eye. Instinctively, his hand brushed the inside pocket of his coat, where a small notebook rested, a record of debts, favors, and secrets. The world ran on information, and Ivankov understood that better than anyone. The men who thought they controlled the streets often failed to see the true game being played. And tonight, the board was being set for something far larger than Moscow, something that would eventually stretch across oceans, from the alleys of his homeland to the beaches of America. For now, he continued through the misty streets, a silent observer in a city that thrived on chaos. Every glance, every passing figure, every whisper in the wind was noted and catalogued. Vyacheslav Ivankov had learned the ultimate lesson of the underworld. True power was not in what you showed, but in what you concealed. And as the night deepened and the fog thickened around him, he walked onward, unseen, untouchable, a ghost in Moscow. The city of Moscow faded behind him, swallowed by fog and memory. Vyacheslav Ivankov, Yaponchik, walked with the same quiet precision he had honed over decades, yet tonight his mind was elsewhere, on a horizon not defined by brick and frost, but by ocean waves and unfamiliar streets. America awaited, a new playground for the clever, a landscape ripe with opportunity for someone who had mastered the art of invisibility. But crossing borders was never simple. The rules changed, the players were different, and every step required a recalibration of strategy. He lingered at the airport for a moment, adjusting the collar of his coat against the cold that seemed to follow him even indoors. Moscow had been ruthless but familiar. Every alley, every grimy apartment, every shadowed courtyard had been mapped in his mind. Here, surrounded by strangers, he was once again a ghost in a new city, but this ghost carried experience, patience, and the weight of quiet authority. The flight itself was uneventful as planned. Ivankov kept his head low, observing fellow passengers with a detached interest. He noted the nervous tics, the restless tapping of fingers, the way certain men's eyes wandered toward others as if sizing up potential threats. Even in transit he could read the subtle rhythms of human behavior. Brighton Beach was nothing like Moscow. The first thing he noticed stepping out of JFK Airport was the heavy smell of salt and the tang of diesel from the waterfront docks. The streets were narrower than he expected, lined with tightly packed brownstones, small shops with Cyrillic signs, and cafés that boasted Russian pastries and smoked fish. The language itself was a familiar comfort, a bridge between worlds, but the energy was different. Here, people spoke loudly in public, gestures were bigger, and transactions were conducted with a confidence born of opportunity rather than fear. Yet beneath that energy was an undercurrent he recognized instantly, ambition wrapped in caution. He rented a modest apartment above a small bodega, one that overlooked the bustling avenue below. From his window, he could watch the comings and goings, the patterns of human behavior, the subtle hierarchies forming on the sidewalks. He took careful notes, sometimes in a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket, other times in his mind. Every face was catalogued, every movement noted. He observed who greeted whom, who deferred when another approached, who lingered and who disappeared quickly into side streets. These details would matter. In Moscow, survival had been a test of speed and memory. Here, survival, and control, was a game of observation and patient placement. The first few weeks were about mapping the terrain. Ivankov visited every café, bar and corner store, never drawing attention to himself yet noticing everything. He recognized the old-world Russians who still clung to their mother tongue, the ambitious young men with expensive suits who wanted recognition but lacked subtlety, and the law enforcement officers who walked the streets with measured suspicion. Each encounter was an exercise in patience. He never spoke too much, and when he did, it was calculated, neutral, and non-committal. Information was currency, and silence was a shield. At night, he walked the boardwalk, the sound of waves crashing against the pier providing a rhythm that contrasted sharply with Moscow's relentless concrete jungles. He imagined the chessboard of Brighton Beach stretching out before him. Docks where shipments arrived, cafés where deals were discussed in whispers, and alleys where missteps could be fatal. In this city of opportunity, power was subtle. Money could be flaunted, but influence had to be earned quietly. And Ivankov, with his years of reading human behavior, was already 3 moves ahead. One evening, he found himself in a small, dimly lit café that served blini and caviar alongside strong coffee. The air smelled of tobacco and fried onions, a mix that somehow reminded him of home. He noticed a man sitting in the corner, shoulders tense, scanning the room as if expecting someone. Ivankov watched for several minutes before making his approach, his movement deliberate and unhurried. He introduced himself simply, Vyacheslav. The man looked up, startled by the calm authority in his tone, then relaxed ever so slightly. That night, a subtle alliance was formed, not with words but with understanding. Ivankov did not promise protection or friendship. He merely positioned himself in the right place at the right time, allowing the other man to recognize an unspoken hierarchy. As the weeks turned into months, Ivankov's presence became more apparent, though never overt. Shopkeepers began to nod respectfully when he entered, small-time operators approached him quietly to discuss arrangements, and even local law enforcement seemed to note him without taking action. It was a delicate balance. He wielded influence without drawing the kind of attention that could provoke enemies. His reputation was built not on displays of power, but on the quiet certainty of his control. Yet the undercurrent of risk never disappeared. One night, as he walked along a deserted dock, he sensed movement behind him. Shadows flitted across the cracked pavement. A van idled at the edge of the pier, its engine whispering against the night air. Ivankov slowed, letting the sound settle in his mind, calculating the odds. 2 men stepped from the shadows, eyes alert, hands visible but not aggressive. They were scouts, assessing territory, measuring strength. Ivankov acknowledged them with nothing more than a calm nod, a gesture that spoke volumes. They retreated, leaving him alone, and the fog rolled in around him, swallowing both him and the threat in its gray embrace. In that moment, the lesson was clear. In Brighton Beach, just as in Moscow, power belonged to those who saw first, who moved last, who remained invisible until the right moment. He returned to his apartment, the city lights casting muted reflections on the cold pavement below. Sitting at the small kitchen table, he opened his notebook and began mapping the networks, tracing relationships, noting loyalties, debts, and potential threats. Every detail mattered. In this new world, a misstep could be fatal, but patience and observation would always be his allies. Ivankov smiled faintly, a shadow of satisfaction crossing his face. He was not a newcomer here. He was a presence, a ghost quietly taking form. The night deepened, and as he stared out over the boardwalk, Ivankov allowed himself a brief thought. Power traveled in silence. While others shouted, schemed, and displayed their wealth, he moved in the spaces in between. His influence was invisible, yet undeniable. The game was no longer limited to Moscow. Brighton Beach had its own rules, and Ivankov intended to master them, just as he had mastered every shadowed street, every prison cell, every quiet corner of the city he once called home. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, painting the ocean gray with streaks of pale gold, Ivankov was already planning his next steps. There would be meetings, alliances, tests of loyalty. Every decision had to be precise, every interaction carefully measured. He had crossed oceans, but the rules of survival had not changed. Only the board had expanded. And Vyacheslav Ivankov, the ghost from Moscow, was ready to make his presence felt, without ever being seen. Brighton Beach at night was a different world. Neon signs flickered over cafés and corner shops, casting muted reflections on wet pavement. The air smelled of fried fish, salt, and a faint tang of cigarette smoke, a mixture that seemed almost comforting to Ivankov as he walked along the waterfront. Yet beneath the surface of everyday life, a quiet war was brewing. Deals were made in whispers, respect was measured in subtle glances, and power shifted as silently as the tides. Ivankov had been in the neighborhood for several months now, and he had observed enough to begin maneuvering. He knew who held influence, who wanted more, and who was simply trying to survive. Unlike the loud, flashy operators who flaunted money and muscle, Ivankov relied on calculation. Each interaction was a test. Every nod, every pause, every handshake could reveal an ally or an adversary. He had already made small connections, the kind that seemed inconsequential to most but which carried immense weight in his careful ledger of people and power. That night, he walked to a nondescript café on Brighton 7th Street, a place frequented by both longtime Russian expatriates and ambitious local operators. Its interior was dim, tables set close together, and a thin haze of smoke clung to the ceiling. The smell of strong coffee and fried dough filled the air, mingling with the chatter in both Russian and English. Ivankov moved to a corner booth, his back to the wall and his eyes on the entrance. He was never early or late, timing was critical. Across the room, a man in his late 40s approached, cautious but confident. Dmitry Kolesnikov, a mid-level operator with ambitions larger than his reach, slid into the booth without invitation. He looked around, noting the presence of other patrons, and then fixed his gaze on Ivankov. "You wanted to meet," Dmitry said, his accent thick but his tone careful. Ivankov nodded once, small and deliberate, a gesture of acknowledgement. "I observe first," he replied softly. "We speak later." The silence hung for a moment, almost tangible, before Dmitry leaned back, understanding. In this world, words were not always necessary. Actions, posture, timing, and discretion spoke louder than any declaration. Ivankov had already made his point. He was a presence to be recognized but not openly challenged. Over the next hour they discussed logistics, shipping routes, safe houses, minor enforcement operations, all phrased in coded language, always indirect. Ivankov never raised his voice. He asked questions that forced Dmitry to reveal intentions, alliances, and vulnerabilities. Each response was noted meticulously, mentally filed for future reference. By the end of the conversation, Dmitry left with a sense of relief and cautious respect. Ivankov remained, sipping his coffee slowly, analyzing the ebb and flow of the café, the rhythm of the patrons, the subtle signals exchanged among them. It was during this observation that Ivankov first noticed them. Plainclothes men who lingered at the edges of the room, coffee cups in hand, eyes scanning, ears listening. FBI. He had anticipated it. Their interest in new Russian arrivals was well known, and Brighton Beach was a known hub for activity crossing international lines. But Ivankov's movements were deliberate and controlled. There was nothing suspicious about a man drinking coffee and observing human behavior. The FBI could watch, but they would see nothing incriminating. The art of invisibility was his shield. As the weeks passed, Ivankov carefully expanded his network. He spoke to shopkeepers, cafe owners, dock workers, and even the local taxi drivers. Everyone had a role, willingly or not, in the web he was weaving. Deals were brokered quietly, debts were noted, and loyalty was measured not by words but by actions. No one could challenge him openly, Those who attempted to test his resolve found themselves subtly corrected, redirected, or marginalized without confrontation. In Brighton Beach, power could be both seen and unseen, and Ivankov excelled at the latter. One evening, a minor confrontation arose. A local operator, emboldened by new arrivals from Russia, attempted to assert dominance over a shipment route along the docks. He underestimated Ivankov's presence. The confrontation was handled entirely through indirect pressure. Messages passed, friends reminded of old loyalties, small obstacles placed strategically. By the end of the week, the operator had realigned, his ambitions tempered, without a single public altercation. It was a lesson Ivankov valued deeply. Influence, not violence, was the ultimate currency. But the quiet was not absolute. News traveled fast and tensions grew. Other criminal elements, both Russian and American, began to take notice of the new figure in town. Whispers of the ghost from Moscow began circulating, always careful, never definitive. Ivankov was aware that such attention was inevitable. Any rise to prominence, no matter how measured, would invite scrutiny. He accepted this with the same calm detachment he applied to everything else. Observation first, movement second. Silence first, action later. Even FBI scrutiny could be turned into a tool. By allowing them to believe he was a minor player, Ivankov ensured their eyes were on the wrong events, the wrong people. Meanwhile, he quietly strengthened alliances, consolidated influence, and ensured his operations were insulated from detection. The intelligence he gathered from observation became another weapon, used subtly, indirectly, and always effectively. As the city lights reflected on wet pavement and the boardwalk hummed with the quiet rhythm of the night, Ivankov considered the next stage of his strategy. Brighton Beach was a chessboard, and he was preparing to place the most critical pieces. Relationships had to be nurtured. Trust had to be earned and measured. Threats had to be neutralized without public exposure. Every move required foresight, patience, and meticulous attention to detail. It was in these moments, walking alone along the pier, the ocean breeze carrying the scent of salt and fish, that Ivankov truly felt the thrill of the game. The stakes were higher than Moscow, the players more unpredictable, yet the rules remained the same. Observe first. Act last. Influence through subtlety. And always remain a ghost. One night, as he walked past a series of warehouses near the docks, he noticed a shipment arriving. A small container, offloaded quietly, guarded by men who did not recognize the significance of their cargo. Ivankov's mind raced, cataloging possibilities, assessing risk, calculating potential gain. Within minutes, he had formulated a plan. A simple adjustment to the chain of custody, a few conversations, and the shipment would be effectively under his influence without anyone ever realizing it. Precision, subtlety, and timing would accomplish more than confrontation ever could. By now, his reputation in Brighton Beach was solidifying. Minor operators deferred when he entered a room. His subtle gestures carried meaning. Even the police and federal agents found themselves observing him without cause, intrigued yet unable to act. His presence was a paradox. Everywhere and nowhere at once. To outsiders, he was simply another Russian expatriate trying to make his way. To insiders, he was a man who could quietly rearrange the landscape of influence, ensuring loyalty and obedience without ever speaking a threat. And yet, for all his careful planning, the tension never abated. Each day brought a new potential challenge. A rival operator looking to expand, a law enforcement officer too curious, an ally too ambitious. Ivankov welcomed it. The game was at its most exciting when every variable had to be accounted for, when every interaction had the potential to tip the delicate balance he maintained. Sitting alone in his apartment late one evening, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room, Ivankov opened his notebook. Names, debts, observations, and possible alliances were catalogued meticulously. Maps of the neighborhood, with subtle notes on who frequented which locations, were spread across the table. He sipped tea slowly, allowing himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Every piece of the puzzle was in place. Brighton Beach, with its alleys, its docks, its cafés, its quiet observers, was beginning to bend to his will. The game was far from over. Rivals would test him, federal agents would probe, alliances would shift. But Vyacheslav Ivankov had survived Moscow's prisons, outmaneuvered the most cunning of operators, and learned the art of remaining unseen. Brighton Beach was just another stage, a new board for an old master. And as the fog rolled in from the Atlantic, curling around lampposts and railings, Ivankov smiled faintly, invisible to all yet aware of everything. In this world of quiet observation and silent power, he was not just a player. He was a ghost, and ghosts by nature left no trace. Brighton Beach had grown colder in the last few weeks, not because of the wind off the Atlantic, but because of the whispers circulating through the cafés, bars and alleys. Names were mentioned quietly, sometimes almost reverently: the ghost from Moscow. It was a nickname that carried weight, though few understood the full measure of its meaning. Vyacheslav Ivankov walked the streets with the same measured pace as always, observing, cataloging and predicting, but now, more than ever, he felt the subtle pressure of attention. The first challenge had come unexpectedly. A local operator, a brash man named Sergei Volkov, had been making noise about controlling a shipment route along the docks. He was young, ambitious, and dangerously unaware of the currents beneath his feet. Word of Volkov's intentions reached Ivankov not through direct communication but through careful observation and a network of minor allies. A man dropping a package late at night, a conversation overheard in a café, a subtle hesitation in a handshake, these were the breadcrumbs that Ivankov collected, forming a complete picture of the threat. He decided on a subtle approach. No confrontation, no display of force, just precise pressure applied through carefully selected intermediaries. Over the next several days, small disruptions appeared: deliveries delayed, minor disagreements between Volkov and his own partners, whispers of law enforcement interest. Ivankov did nothing directly. The ripple effect of his influence quietly reshaped the situation. By the end of the week, Volkov had retreated, his ambitions tempered, though he would never speak of the ghost who had manipulated events around him. But the quiet victory was only the beginning. Other players were beginning to notice Ivankov's presence, and with attention came risk. Federal agents had ramped up surveillance. Plainclothes officers lingered near the docks, cafés, and small shops where Russian expatriates congregated. Their notes were meticulous, their observations relentless. Yet for all their effort, Ivankov remained a step ahead. Every meeting was coded, every movement calculated. He allowed them to follow shadows, to misinterpret intentions, while he moved freely within the network he was building. One night, a meeting was arranged in a dimly lit back room of a seafood café. Ivankov had requested it, and attendance was carefully controlled. His allies, minor operators and shopkeepers whose loyalty had been subtly earned over weeks, sat in silence as Ivankov entered. He didn't sit immediately. He walked around the room, scanning each face, noting expressions, body language and subtle micro-reactions. The quiet authority he radiated demanded attention without a word. He finally sat at the head of the table. A single nod was enough to signal the meeting had begun. Conversations proceeded with minimal speech, each participant offering small, coded updates about shipments, disputes and opportunities. Ivankov asked precise questions, forcing the others to reveal intentions and capabilities without ever appearing confrontational. His mental ledger grew: debts, favors, minor alliances, potential threats, all meticulously recorded and analyzed. As the night deepened, tension built. The sound of footsteps outside the café, heavier, slower than usual, alerted Ivankov. He didn't flinch. The footsteps were deliberate, controlled, and meant to be noticed. He had anticipated them. Two men entered the room, their appearance casual but their eyes scanning, assessing. Federal agents, plainclothes, perhaps tipped off by some minor error, or perhaps by instinct. Ivankov remained calm, sipping his tea, observing their every movement. To the untrained eye, he was simply another patron. To those who could read the shadows, he was a presence that dominated the space without moving. The agents lingered for a few minutes, murmuring to one another, and then exited, leaving no trace of confrontation. Ivankov didn't follow. Observation had been enough. He understood their limitations, their patterns, and their predictable behaviors. Their presence was a variable to be accounted for, not a threat to be directly engaged. The following days brought additional challenges. Rivals, emboldened by their perception of his restraint, tested boundaries in subtle ways. Minor shipments disappeared, alliances were questioned, and the air in the cafés and shops carried a tension that hadn't been present before. Ivankov responded not with overt displays of power, but with quiet recalibration. A meeting here, a subtle word there, a minor adjustment in logistics. By maintaining control without confrontation, he reinforced his authority and deepened the perception of his omnipresence. One particularly tense evening, Ivankov visited the docks under the cover of fog. The Atlantic's waves lapped quietly against the piers, masking the subtle noises of human movement. He observed a shipment being unloaded. A crate moved quickly, efficiently, but without oversight. His instincts tingled. Something was off. He noted the markings, the men present, and the timing. By the time the crate reached its intended destination, Ivankov had already plotted several contingencies: who would be involved, how to ensure loyalty, and how to redirect potential interference. Meanwhile, in the background, Brighton Beach's Russian community was beginning to murmur about the newcomer. Businessmen, minor operators, and street-level figures all sensed a shift. There was an invisible hand guiding events, a subtle influence that no one could trace but which seemed to touch every critical point in the network. Whispers of the ghost from Moscow circulated, growing with every small adjustment Ivankov made. And for all his invisibility, the effect of his actions was undeniable. Even as he strengthened his influence locally, Ivankov kept a vigilant eye on the larger picture. FBI surveillance, rival ambitions, and the unpredictability of human behavior were variables to be constantly managed. He developed a system. Minor operatives served as eyes and ears, neighborhood routines were analyzed, and potential threats were cataloged. Every interaction, no matter how small, was evaluated for risk and potential advantage. In this way he extended his control without ever stepping into the spotlight. Yet the tension was mounting. One night, a courier carrying critical documents for one of Ivankov's partners was intercepted. The mistake was minor, but it highlighted the fragility of even carefully constructed plans. Ivankov responded with swift, precise recalibration. New routes were established, trust was reinforced with small incentives, and the mistake was turned into an opportunity to subtly remind all involved of the unseen influence that guided events. By the time anyone realized the significance, Ivankov had already ensured that loyalty and obedience were reinforced, without a single overt threat. The balance of power in Brighton Beach was delicate, but Ivankov thrived in such conditions. He was a ghost moving between shadows, controlling outcomes without drawing attention. Every café, every shop, every dockside interaction contributed to a web that extended beyond sight, yet held together with precision. Rivals tested boundaries, federal agents observed, and minor operatives executed routines, all under the quiet, calculating gaze of the man who had once survived Moscow's prisons and alleys. By the end of the month, Ivankov's influence had become undeniable. Minor disputes resolved in his favor, shipments redirected seamlessly, and the whispers of his presence had solidified into legend. Yet he remained unseen, a silent orchestrator, moving pieces across a board no one else could fully comprehend. Every action was calculated, every reaction anticipated. Brighton Beach was no longer just a place to observe. It was a domain he was quietly mastering. As dawn broke over the Atlantic, painting the ocean gray with streaks of gold, Ivankov stood on the boardwalk, watching the world awaken. He understood that control was never static. Every day brought new challenges, new variables, and new opportunities. Yet he faced them with the same calm, deliberate approach that had carried him from Moscow to America. In a city full of ambition and risk, Vyacheslav Ivankov was not just surviving. He was shaping the very currents of influence, a ghost whose presence was felt everywhere, yet seen nowhere. The stage was set. Rivals would rise, agents would probe, and the delicate balance of power would be tested again and again. But Ivankov had learned one unassailable truth. Influence carried silently, observed carefully, and executed precisely, was far more formidable than any gun, any shout, or any threat. And as he melted back into the shadows of Brighton Beach, the fog curling around his figure, one thing was certain: where he walked, nothing was ever truly random. Brighton Beach had become a chessboard, and every pawn, rook, and knight had its place. Vyacheslav Ivankov moved among them with quiet certainty, each step deliberate, each glance calculated. But even the most meticulous player could not anticipate every move of the board. Rivals were watching, law enforcement was probing, and the currents of human ambition were unpredictable. Tonight, the tension in the air was palpable, thickening the fog that rolled off the Atlantic and curling around the dockside warehouses like a silent, suffocating shroud. Ivankov had received word through his network of minor operatives. A rival faction, emboldened by recent successes, was planning to assert control over a critical shipment route along the waterfront. The players were young, impatient, and dangerously overconfident. They had underestimated the ghost from Moscow, the man whose reputation had spread quietly but insidiously, whispered among dockworkers and cafe owners alike. He arrived at the warehouse late in the evening, the fog enveloping him as he approached. The smell of salt and fish was stronger here, mixed with the faint aroma of diesel and decay. Shadows shifted behind crates and shipping containers. He observed the rival operators carefully, noting the distribution of their personnel, their routines, and their assumptions. None of them had seen him yet, though he could sense their awareness increasing with each passing moment. Their confidence was palpable but flawed. Ivankov waited, allowing the tension to build. He did not confront them directly. Instead, he orchestrated a subtle disruption, a minor misdirection in the movement of crates, a whispered warning to a loyal intermediary, a carefully placed obstacle that slowed the rival faction without exposing his hand. Within hours, their plans began to unravel. Deliveries were delayed, minor disputes erupted, and confusion spread through their ranks. By the time they realized what was happening, Ivankov had already ensured his influence remained intact, his authority unquestioned. But the night was far from over. News of the disruption traveled quickly, and it drew attention beyond the waterfront. Federal agents, already monitoring the area, became aware of the sudden disturbances. Plainclothes officers began canvassing the docks more frequently, their presence heavier, more pronounced. Ivankov observed them with the same calm detachment he applied to all variables. He knew they were watching, that they would report every detail, and that any misstep could compromise his operations. He adapted. Meetings were moved to quieter locations, back rooms of cafés, private apartments above shops, and occasionally the unlit corners of the boardwalk. Communication became more coded, more indirect, relying on signals, gestures, and subtle shifts in timing. Every interaction, no matter how small, was a calculated move in a larger game. The ghost from Moscow had learned to turn attention into advantage, and the eyes of the FBI, rather than being a threat, became a tool to manipulate perception and expectation. One evening, Ivankov received a message from a trusted intermediary. A minor ally had been approached by a group intent on testing his loyalty. The ally's response was cautious, measured, and respectful, but it revealed the undercurrent of tension brewing among the various factions. Ivankov considered the implications carefully. He would not react hastily. Instead, he devised a series of small maneuvers designed to reinforce loyalty, assert influence, and destabilize potential threats, all without exposing himself. The elegance of such strategy lay in its invisibility. No confrontations, no gunfire, no public display, yet the outcome was as decisive as any battle. Over the next several nights, Ivankov walked the streets of Brighton Beach, observing, noting, and predicting. The fog seemed almost alive, swallowing the contours of the boardwalk and alleys, masking movement while highlighting subtle details. The flicker of a cigarette in a shadowed doorway, the creak of a cart wheel on wet pavement, the brief hesitation of a man adjusting a delivery crate. Each observation was catalogued, integrated into a mental map that grew more complex and precise with every passing hour. Then came the confrontation he had been anticipating. The rival faction, frustrated by repeated disruptions, attempted a direct challenge. A small group approached a shipment under Ivankov's control, intending to assert dominance through intimidation. Ivankov was present, though unseen. He allowed the first approaches to unfold, watching carefully as the men revealed their intentions through posture, hesitation, and subtle micro-expressions. Within moments, he had calculated the precise interventions required. He signaled to two loyal operatives nearby, who adjusted the positioning of crates and subtly shifted the environment. The rival men paused, confused by the sudden obstacles and minor disruptions. Ivankov then stepped forward, his presence deliberate but calm. A single glance, a slight movement of his hand, communicated authority without words. The rivals hesitated, their aggression faltering in the face of an unseen but palpable force. No guns were drawn, no threats shouted, yet control had shifted. Ivankov's reputation alone had redirected the course of events. The following morning, word of the incident had spread quietly. Observers noted the sudden shift in allegiance and behavior among local operators. No one openly challenged Ivankov again. His influence had been reinforced, and the ghost from Moscow had proven once more that power could be asserted silently, decisively, and without overt violence. Yet the dangers remained. FBI interest was intensifying. Agents had begun mapping the network of relationships in Brighton Beach, noting every movement, every minor transaction, and every interaction among Russian expatriates. Ivankov had anticipated this escalation and adjusted accordingly. Meetings were now staggered, communications coded, and movements choreographed to appear random to casual observers while remaining highly deliberate to those in the know. Every action was designed to maintain influence while minimizing exposure. By mid-month, Ivankov had solidified a network that extended from the waterfront warehouses to cafés, bistros, and small shops along the boardwalk. Loyalty had been earned subtly, threats neutralized without overt conflict, and influence extended across critical nodes of commerce and social interaction. Rivals had learned caution, minor operators had learned obedience, and federal agents were chasing shadows. Brighton Beach, once a chaotic mix of ambition and opportunity, had begun to bend to the quiet authority of the ghost from Moscow. In the quiet hours of the night, Ivankov often walked alone along the boardwalk, the Atlantic wind cutting through his coat, the fog curling around him like a cloak. He observed the rhythms of the neighborhood, deliveries arriving and departing, patrons moving through cafés, the subtle exchanges that defined trust, loyalty, and control. Each element was part of a larger design, a map of influence and power carefully curated to ensure both survival and dominance. Even as he walked, his mind calculated future moves. Contingencies were planned, threats anticipated, alliances nurtured. He knew the ebb and flow of power was never static, and that every day brought new challenges and new variables. Yet, for all the complexity, Ivankov remained calm, deliberate, and invisible to all but the most perceptive observers. The fog hid him physically, but his influence reached everywhere, shaping outcomes and guiding behavior with subtle precision. By dawn, the streets were quiet again. Shopkeepers prepared for the day, dockworkers began their routines, and life in Brighton Beach moved forward, seemingly unremarkable to anyone who did not know the undercurrents beneath its surface. Ivankov returned to his modest apartment, opened his notebook and reviewed every detail: shipments, loyalties, debts, observations, and potential threats. His ledger was meticulous, comprehensive, and, most importantly, actionable. He allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, a rare smile flickering across his face. He had survived Moscow's alleys, outmaneuvered rivals in both prisons and streets, and now, in a foreign land, he was asserting control with the same calm efficiency. The ghost from Moscow was no longer just a presence whispered about in cafés and along the boardwalk. He was a force shaping the destiny of Brighton Beach, silently, invisibly, and inevitably. Yet the night had also reminded him that vigilance was eternal. Rivals would rise again, ambitions would flare, and federal agents would continue their scrutiny. Each variable required careful observation, precise calculation, and subtle intervention. The balance of power was delicate, but Vyacheslav Ivankov thrived in such conditions. He was a ghost who moved through shadows, controlling outcomes without leaving a trace. And in the intricate, dangerous, and constantly shifting world of Brighton Beach, that was the ultimate advantage. The game was only beginning and Ivankov was ready. The tides of challenge had arrived, and as they collided with the ghost from Moscow, one thing was certain. In a city of ambition and secrecy, influence traveled silently, and those who could wield it without exposure held the true power. Brighton Beach was waking to a cold dawn, the Atlantic mist curling along the piers like a living entity, masking movement and reshaping shadows. Vyacheslav Ivankov stepped onto the boardwalk, his dark coat pulled high against the wind, his eyes scanning the familiar streets with their subtle rhythms of life. Everything seemed normal to a casual observer: the smell of fried fish from the corner cafe, the distant hum of early deliveries along the waterfront, the shuffle of feet on wet pavement. But Ivankov knew better. The calm was a veneer, a fragile surface stretched over currents of ambition, envy, and scrutiny that could erupt at any moment. He had sensed the storm for weeks. A rival faction, led by a man named Anatoly the Hammer Morozov, had been consolidating power along the docks, assembling a force bold enough to challenge the quiet control Ivankov had painstakingly established. Morozov's men were loud, aggressive, and careless, flaunting wealth and muscle in a manner that exposed their intentions. Unlike the subtle manipulators Ivankov preferred to deal with, Morozov operated openly, leaving footprints, drawing attention, and tempting confrontation. It was a threat that could not be ignored, not for his network, not for his reputation, and certainly not for the delicate balance of power in Brighton Beach. Ivankov did not rush. He had learned over decades that haste was the enemy of strategy. He observed first, cataloging the routines of Morozov's men, noting their patterns, timing their movements, identifying weaknesses in coordination and loyalty. Every action, every pause, every minor sign of fatigue or arrogance became part of a growing map in his mind. He would strike, but only when the conditions were perfect, when the advantage was absolute, and when no exposure could compromise the network he had built. That evening he entered a small warehouse near the edge of the piers, a place familiar to local operators but unremarkable to outsiders. The interior was dim, lit only by flickering fluorescent bulbs that cast long shadows across stacks of crates and pallets. Loyal operatives had been instructed to position themselves discreetly, observing Morozov's movements while maintaining the illusion of routine activity. Ivankov's presence was deliberate but unobtrusive. He did not announce himself, he did not demand attention. Yet the moment he entered, the subtle shift in the room's energy was palpable. Those who could read the atmosphere felt the weight of his authority immediately. As the night progressed, the confrontation unfolded in quiet but decisive steps. Morozov's men moved in, expecting to intimidate, to assert dominance through proximity and display. Ivankov remained calm, allowing them to act first, observing each micro-expression, noting hesitation and overconfidence alike. His operatives executed small, precise maneuvers, adjusting crate positions, redirecting movement, subtly disrupting communication. Within hours, confusion had begun to spread through Morozov's ranks. A shipment was delayed, a route became inaccessible, and minor alliances within the rival faction began to falter under the pressure of unseen forces. Ivankov had created chaos without a single direct confrontation. Meanwhile, the FBI had intensified their scrutiny. Plainclothes agents had been observing the waterfront, recording license plates, mapping interactions, noting arrivals and departures of key personnel. Ivankov anticipated their presence. He adjusted meetings, staggered schedules, and utilized coded communication to ensure operational security. Their attention was relentless, but it was also predictable. By understanding their methods, he could manipulate perception, directing their focus away from critical moves while maintaining complete control over the unfolding scenario. One night, a courier carrying critical documents was intercepted by Morozov's men, who were unaware of the true importance of the shipment. Ivankov, observing from a shadowed vantage point, noted the opportunity. A subtle intervention through a loyal intermediary corrected the disruption, ensuring the materials reached their intended destination. The rival faction, frustrated and demoralized, began to reassess its strategy. The lesson was implicit but unmistakable. Challenges to the ghost from Moscow were met with precision, strategy, and invisible force. As tensions escalated, Ivankov began to implement more intricate maneuvers. He leveraged minor disputes between Morozov's subordinates, creating fractures in loyalty and trust. Subtle financial pressures were applied through intermediaries, debts were recalculated, and alliances were quietly restructured. By the time the rival faction recognized the pattern, Ivankov had already strengthened his own network, solidifying influence across the critical nodes of the waterfront operations. Despite the growing pressure from rivals and law enforcement, Ivankov remained disciplined. He spent hours each night analyzing patterns, noting minor shifts in behavior, adjusting contingencies, and planning responses to every conceivable scenario. His presence was everywhere yet nowhere, a phantom influencing outcomes without revealing itself. The first direct confrontation came unexpectedly. A small faction loyal to Morozov attempted to assert control over a critical dockside shipment. Ivankov, anticipating the move, had positioned loyal operatives to intercept and redirect the cargo subtly. When the rival men arrived, they encountered precisely what Ivankov intended: minor obstacles, logistical challenges, and the perception that the area was already under firm control. Confusion and hesitation spread through their ranks, and by the time they realized the scope of Ivankov's orchestration, the shipment was secure, and the ghost from Moscow had again demonstrated his supremacy. In parallel, Ivankov continued to navigate the growing scrutiny of federal agents. Their reports, collected meticulously over weeks, allowed him to predict patrols, observation points, and potential breaches in operational security. Every step he took, every meeting he arranged, was calculated to maintain invisibility while reinforcing influence. He had learned the ultimate lesson of both Moscow and Brighton Beach. Visibility was vulnerability, and control could be absolute when exerted without exposure. By midweek, the ripple effects of Ivankov's maneuvers were evident throughout Brighton Beach. Rivals had tempered their ambitions, minor operators deferred quietly, and federal agents chased patterns that led nowhere. The neighborhood itself had begun to align, subtly, with the influence of the ghost from Moscow. Shops, cafés, warehouses, and even street-level interactions were part of a larger web of observation and control, meticulously curated to maintain dominance and security. Yet Ivankov knew that complacency was a luxury he could not afford. New variables emerged daily: ambitious newcomers, unpredictable operatives, and the ever-present threat of federal intervention. Each required careful observation, strategic adjustment, and subtle intervention. The balance of power was delicate, yet the ghost thrived in such conditions. As the nights wore on, Ivankov spent hours walking along the fog-drenched boardwalk, observing the city's rhythms. Each sound, each shadow, each whisper was analyzed and integrated into his mental map. He catalogued movements, interactions, and opportunities, ensuring that the intricate web he had built remained resilient. Brighton Beach was no longer simply a place to observe, it was a dynamic network under his quiet influence, a living, breathing board on which he moved with precision and foresight. By the end of the chapter, Ivankov had reinforced his dominance over the waterfront, disrupted rival operations without direct confrontation, and maintained strategic invisibility from federal agents. The ghost from Moscow had proven once again that power traveled silently, that influence could be exerted without overt action, and that in a city of ambition and secrecy, the unseen hand was often the most formidable force. The fog hung heavier than usual along the Brighton Beach boardwalk, curling around lampposts and casting long, shifting shadows across the cracked pavement. The Atlantic wind carried the scent of salt, diesel, and fried fish, mixing into an olfactory backdrop that Ivankov had come to associate with observation and calculation. He moved slowly, deliberately, each step measured, each glance absorbing more information than an outsider could perceive. Tonight, the boardwalk would become a stage, a chessboard upon which the most critical moves of his Brighton Beach tenure would unfold. Anatoly, the hammer Morozov, had made his presence known. Over the past weeks, Morozov's faction had grown bolder, pushing further into territory Ivankov had painstakingly established. Their overt displays of power, loud voices, muscular enforcers, ostentatious shipments, were meant to intimidate, to provoke a reaction. Yet Ivankov remained unshaken. He had anticipated such moves and had already begun preparing his responses, crafting a web of subtle influence that would counteract any attempt at aggression without revealing his hand prematurely. The evening began with routine observation. Ivankov positioned himself on a balcony overlooking a small café that faced the piers. Patrons moved in and out, oblivious to the silent calculations being made above them. Across the street, Morozov's men unloaded a shipment from a van, their movements loud, careless, but efficient. Ivankov noted every detail: the distribution of guards, the timing of the unload, the positioning of the crates, even the interactions between subordinates. Each minor action carried insight into their strategy and psychology. Ivankov's network of loyal operatives was in place. Individuals positioned along key points, the dockside warehouses, nearby cafés, and adjacent streets, were ready to implement subtle interventions. Their roles were precise. A crate moved slightly off course, a message delivered with a coded inflection, a minor distraction at the exact right moment. These interventions were designed to disrupt, confuse, and subtly assert influence, all while maintaining the appearance of normal activity. Morozov's faction, unaware of the orchestrated pressure around them, continued their operations with confidence. But cracks began to appear. A minor delay here, a hesitant glance there, whispers among subordinates. These signs were invisible to most, but Ivankov read them as clearly as any open book. Within hours, the first wave of disruption had taken effect. Shipments were rerouted without exposure, minor disputes arose, and internal cohesion within Morozov's ranks began to fracture. As dusk descended, Ivankov descended from his vantage point, moving with the deliberate calm of a predator. He did not confront directly. Confrontation was the last resort. Instead, he executed a series of subtle maneuvers that shifted the balance of control. A crate previously designated for a Morozov-controlled warehouse was quietly redirected to a loyalist contact. Subtle signals communicated through intermediaries reinforced loyalty among operatives aligned with Ivankov, while sowing uncertainty among those still wavering. The effect was cumulative, silent, yet decisive. The real tension emerged as the FBI intensified surveillance. Plainclothes agents patrolled key intersections, recorded license plates, and monitored interactions. Ivankov had anticipated this escalation. He adjusted meetings, staggered schedules, and employed coded communication. His movements remained innocuous to the casual observer, yet every interaction was purposeful. The agents, despite their attention and resources, were drawn into a web of misdirection. They observed, but they could not discern the patterns being executed above their comprehension. Morozov, growing frustrated with the subtle resistance, decided on a direct challenge. A small contingent of his men approached one of Ivankov's key shipping points late at night, intending to assert control through intimidation. Ivankov, already aware of the move through his operatives, allowed the approach to unfold partially, observing the body language, the hesitation, and the decision-making processes within the rival group. His presence was felt without being seen. A single subtle gesture, an adjustment of a crate, a slight shift in positioning by an operative, introduced uncertainty. The rival men paused, their aggression faltering in the face of an unseen authority. The confrontation escalated incrementally. Small maneuvers, redirections, and interventions created a cascade of hesitation and minor errors among Morozov's men. Within hours, the attempted assertion of dominance had collapsed under the weight of invisible influence. Not a shot was fired, not a word of direct threat uttered, yet control had shifted decisively. The ghost from Moscow had asserted authority without confrontation, demonstrating that influence exerted subtly could surpass brute force. Meanwhile, Ivankov's personal observation extended beyond immediate threats. He monitored the interactions between loyal operatives, minor allies, and neutral parties, ensuring cohesion and mitigating the risk of betrayal or error. Every expression, every pause, every slight gesture was analyzed, catalogued, and factored into future strategy. His ledger of influence extended across the neighborhood. Shipments, debts, favors, loyalties, and potential threats, all interconnected within a lattice of observation and intervention. As the night deepened, the fog thickened. The Atlantic mist curled around lampposts, obscuring movements and amplifying the tension. Ivankov walked alone along the boardwalk, the rhythm of the waves against the pier providing a constant, subtle backdrop. Each step was calculated, each pause deliberate. He considered the broader landscape, the interplay of rival factions, the scrutiny of federal agents, and the unpredictable element of human behavior. The stakes were higher than ever, and the margin for error was infinitesimal. By the early hours of dawn, Ivankov had orchestrated several layers of subtle interventions, neutralized direct challenges from Morozov, reinforced the loyalty of his operatives, and maintained strategic invisibility from the FBI. Brighton Beach was, in effect, aligned with his influence. The ghost from Moscow had turned observation into dominance, silence into authority, and invisibility into power. Yet Ivankov knew the game was far from over. Ambition, greed, and curiosity were constants in human behavior. Rivals would regroup, new players would emerge, and federal agents would continue to probe. Every variable required monitoring, every relationship required cultivation, and every potential disruption required contingency planning. Ivankov had survived Moscow's alleys, navigated its prison systems, and outmaneuvered countless rivals. Brighton Beach was merely the next board, the next stage where strategy, patience, and subtlety would determine survival and supremacy. As the first light of morning streaked across the horizon, painting the Atlantic gray with faint traces of gold, Ivankov paused at the edge of the pier. The city was waking, moving in patterns both ordinary and extraordinary. He observed, catalogued, and planned. Every ripple on the water, every shuffle of feet, every distant call carried significance. The ghost from Moscow had established his presence, yet remained unseen. In the intricate, dangerous, and shifting world of Brighton Beach, he had become a force that could shape events without ever revealing itself. The storm of rivalry and scrutiny had arrived, and Ivankov was ready. The tides of challenge were colliding with his meticulous planning, and yet the ghost remained calm, deliberate, and unstoppable. Every opponent, every agent, every potential threat would find themselves navigating a landscape already mapped, calculated, and subtly controlled. Brighton Beach was no longer merely a city of opportunity, it was a domain shaped by the quiet, inexorable authority of Vyacheslav Ivankov. Brighton Beach had grown tense in a way that was palpable even to the untrained eye. The boardwalk, usually bustling with the aroma of fried fish and the chatter of early risers, now carried a quiet, almost electric stillness. People moved cautiously, aware of whispers but unaware of the full scope of what was happening. Vyacheslav Ivankov walked among them, his dark coat pulled tightly against the Atlantic chill, eyes observing, calculating, always observing. He was calm, but within him, a storm was building. The first direct confrontation with Anatoly, the hammer, Morozov, and his increasingly aggressive faction. The morning began with subtle signs of unrest. Shipments arrived late, minor operatives hesitated, and the usual rhythms of the docks and cafés were disrupted by tension that seemed to radiate invisibly. Ivankov noted these disruptions with meticulous care, mentally cataloging each variable. He understood that the storm was approaching, that challenges would come not as whispers but as actions, direct and unavoidable. His first move was observation. From a balcony overlooking a café near the piers, Ivankov watched Morozov's men unloading crates with practiced efficiency. They were loud, confident, and careless, exactly the way he wanted them to appear. He could see their weaknesses: overconfidence, impatience, and subtle divisions among their ranks. These would be critical leverage points when the confrontation escalated. By late afternoon, Ivankov had coordinated a series of maneuvers with his loyal operatives. Every detail was accounted for: placement of crates, timing of minor deliveries, and even the positioning of shadows for maximum strategic advantage. He did not move directly into the fray. Instead, he orchestrated the environment, allowing the natural progression of events to work in his favor. This was a chess game, and he was several moves ahead, unseen but omnipresent. As evening descended, the tension became almost tangible. Morozov's faction attempted a direct assertion of control, moving a significant shipment through a key corridor under Ivankov's influence. The rivals expected a confrontation, but they underestimated the ghost from Moscow. Ivankov allowed them to proceed, carefully monitoring their movements, noting every micro-expression, hesitation, and minor error. His operatives subtly adjusted the environment. Crates shifted imperceptibly, minor obstructions appeared, and the perception of oversight increased. The effect was cumulative, creating confusion and frustration without a single open confrontation. The first direct face-to-face encounter occurred later that night. Ivankov had positioned himself near a narrow alleyway that connected two key warehouses. Morozov, emboldened by previous small victories and unaware of the full scope of Ivankov's influence, approached with two lieutenants. Their intent was clear: intimidation, assertion of dominance, and a warning to anyone aligned with Ivankov. The ghost from Moscow, however, remained calm, his presence quiet but commanding. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he allowed the rivals to fully expose themselves, watching as their overconfidence led them to make mistakes in posture, approach, and timing. With a single, deliberate gesture to his operatives, minor adjustments redirected the environment subtly, creating hesitation among Morozov's men. Confusion spread through their ranks almost imperceptibly, their planned intimidation faltering under invisible pressure. Ivankov finally stepped forward, his presence measured and deliberate. He did not threaten. He demonstrated control through composure, timing, and the silent authority that had become his trademark. The confrontation ended without violence, yet the outcome was decisive. Morozov's faction was forced to retreat, reassessing their position and influence. The ghost from Moscow had asserted dominance without a shot fired, a strategy that amplified his reputation while minimizing risk. This silent victory reinforced loyalty among Ivankov's operatives and subtly intimidated other factions contemplating challenge. Parallel to these events, FBI surveillance intensified. Plainclothes agents, already monitoring key intersections and known associates, noted the sudden shifts in activity around the docks and warehouses. Ivankov anticipated their focus, using misdirection, staggered meetings, and coded communications to maintain operational security. The agents, despite their resources and vigilance, were observing only what he allowed them to see. Their attention was manipulated into patterns that concealed the full extent of his influence. The strategic pressure continued over the following days. Minor factions tested boundaries, attempting to capitalize on perceived openings. Each attempt was neutralized subtly, through recalibration of alliances, controlled redistribution of resources, and quiet reinforcement of loyalty. Every action was meticulously measured, every reaction anticipated. Ivankov's ledger of influence grew more comprehensive with each passing moment, encompassing not just operations and shipments, but behavioral patterns, psychological profiles, and environmental variables. By midweek, the first tangible sign of the storm's culmination arrived. A shipment critical to the operations of a Morozov-allied faction was intentionally misdirected, creating internal discord. The minor errors and delays, orchestrated invisibly, forced a re-evaluation of strategy among rival factions. Observers noted shifts in alliances, adjustments in delivery schedules, and minor quarrels among operatives, all subtle, all under the influence of Ivankov's unseen hand. That night, Ivankov walked along the fog-drenched boardwalk, the rhythmic sound of the Atlantic waves a constant companion. He reviewed contingencies mentally, considering every variable, every potential response, every emergent threat. He understood that Brighton Beach was a dynamic environment, one where every actor, ally, and rival was a piece in a larger game. Control required foresight, patience, and the ability to manipulate perception. The ghost from Moscow thrived in such conditions. The culmination of the week's events came with a calculated display of influence. Morozov's faction, attempting a bold maneuver to reassert control over the docks, encountered precisely the challenges Ivankov had engineered: misdirected shipments, subtle delays, loyal operatives positioned at key points, and the omnipresent sense of observation that unnerved even the most confident. By the end of the night, the faction was forced to retreat, their plans disrupted without direct confrontation, their confidence eroded, and their influence diminished. Simultaneously, Ivankov ensured that the FBI's attention remained focused on peripheral activities. Through careful manipulation of timing and movement, surveillance was drawn to inconsequential events, leaving critical operations under his control undetected. By controlling perception, he extended his influence while remaining invisible, a true ghost in the complex network of Brighton Beach. As dawn approached, painting the Atlantic gray with muted streaks of gold, Ivankov surveyed the quiet streets. The storm had arrived, and he had weathered it without losing composure or control. Morozov's aggression had been neutralized, alliances were reinforced, and federal scrutiny had been managed effectively. The ghost from Moscow had demonstrated the power of silent influence, strategic observation, and meticulous planning. The balance of power in Brighton Beach had shifted irreversibly. Ivankov's presence was felt everywhere, even as he remained unseen. Rivals, operatives, and federal agents alike were now navigating a landscape subtly but decisively shaped by his hand. In this intricate, dangerous, and constantly evolving city, Vyacheslav Ivankov had established himself not as a mere participant, but as the orchestrator, the ghost whose influence traveled silently, invisibly, yet irresistibly. And yet, even in victory, Ivankov knew vigilance was eternal. The tides of ambition and rivalry would rise again, new threats would emerge, and every variable required constant attention. But for now, in the quiet hours before the city fully awakened, the ghost from Moscow could rest, briefly, knowing that his meticulous planning, strategic patience, and silent authority had secured a decisive edge in the complex game of Brighton Beach. The Atlantic fog clung to Brighton Beach like a living entity, curling around lampposts and wrapping the piers in a cloak of uncertainty. For months, Vyacheslav Ivankov had moved unseen, shaping influence and steering events without drawing attention. But tonight, the currents of ambition, rivalry, and federal scrutiny converged into a single, palpable tension. The chessboard was set, the pieces in motion, and the first true collision of shadows was about to unfold. Anatoly, the hammer Morozov, had become emboldened. Previous disruptions, orchestrated with surgical precision by Ivankov, had angered him and undermined his authority. His attempts at subtle interference had failed, leaving him frustrated and desperate. Tonight, he intended a direct challenge, a visible assertion of control over critical shipping routes that Ivankov had methodically claimed. Morozov's men were armed, aggressive, and reckless, believing that intimidation could override strategy. They had underestimated the ghost from Moscow. Ivankov, anticipating the move, had already prepared multiple layers of defense and counteraction. His operatives were stationed along key points, the docks, warehouse corners, and even side alleys leading to escape routes. Each had a role, subtle yet decisive, coordinated through signals that were nearly imperceptible to outsiders. Ivankov's influence extended invisibly into every aspect of the planned confrontation, ensuring he maintained the upper hand without exposing himself directly. As the rival faction moved into position, Ivankov observed from a shadowed balcony. The fog obscured his figure, the muted hum of the Atlantic masking every movement. He noted the placement of each man, the timing of their actions, and the subtle interactions between their leaders and subordinates. Every detail fed into his mental map, every variable accounted for. The ghost from Moscow was invisible, but his control over the environment was absolute. The confrontation began quietly, deceptively so. Morozov's men approached a shipment, their movements deliberate yet noisy enough to attract attention. Ivankov allowed them to proceed, knowing that their overconfidence would lead them into subtle traps he had laid out. Crates were shifted just enough to disrupt coordination. Minor obstacles created hesitation. Loyal operatives subtly guided the flow of movement, creating confusion without direct engagement. Morozov's men began to falter, their carefully planned assertion of dominance undermined by forces they could not see. Meanwhile, federal agents intensified their observation. Plainclothes officers recorded movements, tracked vehicles, and noted every interaction along the docks. Ivankov had anticipated their presence and accounted for it. Signals and misdirection ensured that the agents observed patterns of activity that were inconsequential to his operations. Surveillance was drawn to peripheral actions, leaving critical maneuvers under his control undetected. In essence, he turned scrutiny into a tool, using the FBI as unwitting participants in his strategy. Tension escalated as Morozov realized the disruption. Frustration and aggression increased among his men. A lieutenant attempted to confront one of Ivankov's operatives directly, but subtle adjustments in positioning and timing rendered the move ineffective. Confusion rippled through the faction, undermining cohesion. Ivankov remained calm, observing, calculating, and intervening only in ways that preserved invisibility. His authority was established not through force, but through the inevitability of outcomes shaped by unseen influence. By late night, the confrontation reached a critical point. Morozov himself stepped forward, demanding a face-to-face resolution. Ivankov, ever deliberate, positioned himself in a shadowed corridor connecting two warehouses. Morozov's approach was loud, assertive, yet controlled, a display meant to intimidate. Ivankov allowed the confrontation to unfold with minimal overt action. A glance, a subtle shift in body language, the movement of a crate or an operative, all communicated authority without words. Morozov's aggression faltered as he recognized, consciously or not, the invisible force opposing him. The resulting stalemate reinforced Ivankov's dominance. No shots were fired, no direct conflict erupted, yet control had decisively shifted. Morozov's faction, now disoriented and demoralized, retreated. The ghost from Moscow had demonstrated the principle that power wielded invisibly, strategically, and patiently surpassed brute force. Allies' loyalty was strengthened, rivals' ambitions tempered, and federal scrutiny remained misdirected. Over the following days, Ivankov reinforced his network. Minor operatives were repositioned, alliances reassessed, and contingency plans updated. Every shipment, every interaction, every potential threat was analyzed. Brighton Beach, once chaotic and unpredictable, had become a landscape shaped by invisible influence. Ivankov's reputation solidified. He was everywhere yet nowhere, a presence felt but not seen, a ghost manipulating outcomes without leaving a trace. However, vigilance remained essential. Ivankov understood that victory in one encounter did not guarantee long-term control. Morozov's faction would regroup, new players would enter the scene, and federal agents would adjust their strategies. Continuous observation, meticulous planning, and strategic patience were imperative. Every decision, no matter how minor, could tip the delicate balance of power. In the quiet hours before dawn, Ivankov walked the fog-shrouded boardwalk. The rhythm of the waves against the pier provided a constant, subtle soundtrack. He cataloged every detail: the flow of human traffic, the timing of deliveries, the behavior of allies and potential threats. The fog masked his presence physically, but his influence extended invisibly across Brighton Beach. Each move, each intervention, each observation strengthened his position, reinforcing the narrative that control and authority need not be declared loudly, they could be asserted silently, decisively, and invisibly. By sunrise, Brighton Beach had returned to its ordinary rhythm, seemingly unchanged. Shipments moved, cafés opened, and residents went about their routines. Yet beneath the surface, Ivankov's influence was everywhere. Rivals navigated a landscape subtly controlled by the ghost from Moscow, loyalists followed invisible cues, and federal agents were observing patterns that led nowhere. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly, and Ivankov's presence, though unseen, was undeniable. For Ivankov, the collision of shadows was a validation of his strategy. Patience, observation, and subtle influence could achieve what brute force never could. Brighton Beach was no longer simply a collection of streets, piers, and alleys. It was a controlled environment, meticulously shaped by a mind that operated with precision and foresight. The ghost from Moscow had proven, once again, that true power was silent, strategic, and inevitable. And yet, even in victory, he knew the storm was far from over. Ambition, unpredictability, and scrutiny were constants. Rivals would rise again, new threats would emerge, and federal agents would continue to probe. Ivankov's advantage lay not just in his intellect, but in his unwavering discipline, his mastery of observation, and his ability to manipulate the unseen currents of influence. Brighton Beach was his domain, but maintaining control required eternal vigilance. The storm had collided and the ghost had prevailed, but the next wave was already forming on the horizon. The fog hung thicker than ever over Brighton Beach, curling like smoke around lampposts and stretching across the cracked pavement of the boardwalk. The Atlantic hissed against the pier, a constant, subtle percussion that set a rhythm beneath the night. Tonight the air was charged, not just with salt and diesel but with anticipation. The chessboard Ivankov had constructed over months was about to be tested in ways that required precision, foresight, and nerves of steel. Anatoly, the hammer Morozov had escalated his aggression. Previous subtle interventions by Ivankov had not merely frustrated him, they had humiliated him. Morozov's faction was now acting with desperate boldness, intent on asserting control directly, visibly, and forcefully. Crates were moved with purpose, armed men patrolled with a deliberate swagger, and subtle threats were whispered in the ears of allies and intermediaries. The ghost from Moscow had left Morozov with only one perceived path: confrontation. Ivankov observed quietly from a vantage point above the pier, the fog obscuring his figure. He catalogued every movement, the number of men in each group, their positioning, the timing of their patrols, the subtle signs of tension in their posture. This was not a simple brawl, it was a complex dance of influence, loyalty, and intimidation. The slightest misstep could unravel months of careful planning. But Ivankov thrived in such circumstances. Every variable was noted, every potential outcome anticipated, every contingency prepared. As dusk deepened, Morozov's men approached a critical shipment point under the guise of routine activity. Ivankov allowed them to proceed, calculating that their overconfidence would lead them into the carefully constructed web of subtle interventions. Loyal operatives moved unobtrusively to adjust crates, redirect paths, and introduce minor obstacles that created hesitation. The operation unfolded almost like clockwork. Confusion grew within Morozov's ranks as subtle disruptions forced them to adjust on the fly, revealing cracks in coordination and discipline. The first direct confrontation occurred when Morozov himself approached the shipment. His intentions were clear: to assert dominance, intimidate, and if necessary, force submission. Ivankov did not move forward immediately. Instead, he observed, letting Morozov expose not only his plans but also his temperament. The rival's aggression, though carefully measured, betrayed impatience. Ivankov noted the subtle signs: a tightened jaw, a flick of the wrist, a glance that lingered too long. Each micro-expression was a thread he could pull to influence behavior. Through a series of imperceptible signals, Ivankov's operatives subtly shifted the environment. Crates were adjusted, light angles altered, pathways narrowed. The effect was cumulative and almost imperceptible to the naked eye. Morozov's men hesitated, frustration mounting, while Ivankov remained unseen, calculating, and in complete control. The confrontation became psychological rather than physical. Power was exerted not through force but through perception, positioning, and the silent orchestration of environment. Simultaneously, FBI agents had intensified their surveillance, mapping interactions and movements with painstaking detail. Plainclothes officers patrolled, taking note of vehicles, faces, and routines. Ivankov had anticipated their presence and employed misdirection. Signals, staggered meetings, and coded communication ensured that critical actions occurred under layers of plausible deniability. Federal scrutiny, instead of being a threat, became an unwitting tool in reinforcing Ivankov's strategy. By nightfall, the confrontation reached its peak. Morozov's attempts to assert control collided with Ivankov's calculated interventions. Each move by the rival faction triggered a response, subtle but decisive: delays in shipment, miscommunication among subordinates, and minor obstacles that forced hesitation. Morozov's aggression faltered. His carefully constructed intimidation tactics unraveled in the face of invisible, omnipresent control. Ivankov finally made his presence known, not with violence but with authority. A single deliberate step, a measured gaze, and the placement of a loyal operative in a strategic position communicated command. Morozov, confronted by the certainty of Ivankov's unseen hand, recognized defeat without a shot fired. Retreat was inevitable. Control had shifted decisively, loyalty reinforced, and rival ambitions curbed, all executed with the precision of an unseen strategist. The aftermath reinforced Ivankov's dominance. Minor operatives were reassigned, shipments rerouted efficiently, and the network of influence extended seamlessly across Brighton Beach. Morozov's faction, now demoralized and uncertain, recalibrated their strategy, acknowledging the invisible authority they could neither confront nor fully comprehend. The ghost from Moscow had exercised power in its purest form: silent, strategic, and absolute. In the quiet hours before dawn, Ivankov walked the fog-laden boardwalk, observing the city awaken under the muted light. Each step, each shadow, each interaction was a thread in the larger tapestry of control. Every delivery, café visit, and whispered conversation was catalogued, analyzed, and integrated into the evolving strategy. The landscape of Brighton Beach, chaotic to the untrained eye, was now subtly but completely shaped by his influence. Even as the city moved through its routines, the stakes remained high. Rivals would regroup, new threats would emerge, and federal scrutiny would continue. Ivankov's advantage lay not just in observation, but in his ability to manipulate perception, anticipate behavior, and execute interventions with precision. Every variable was accounted for, every potential disruption mitigated, and every opportunity exploited. By sunrise, Brighton Beach had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Shipments moved, shops opened, and residents went about their day, oblivious to the invisible orchestration that governed the undercurrents of their neighborhood. Ivankov, meanwhile, returned to his apartment, opened his ledger, and reviewed the night's events. Every detail was noted: successes, minor errors, potential vulnerabilities, and opportunities for further consolidation of influence. The storm had collided, and the ghost had prevailed. Ivankov had neutralized the direct threat from Morozov, maintained operational secrecy under federal observation, and reinforced his network of loyalty and control. Brighton Beach was no longer merely a setting. It was a landscape molded by strategic foresight and invisible authority. Yet, the ghost from Moscow understood that vigilance was eternal. Ambition, unpredictability, and scrutiny were constants. Rivals would rise again, new actors would appear, and federal agents would adjust their strategies. Continuous observation, meticulous planning, and subtle intervention were required to maintain dominance. Brighton Beach was a living chessboard, and Ivankov, as always, was several moves ahead. In the quiet aftermath, as the first rays of sunlight glinted off the Atlantic, Ivankov allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The collision of shadows had affirmed his strategy. Power need not be loud to be absolute, authority could be exerted silently yet decisively, and influence extended invisibly across the city. The ghost from Moscow had once again demonstrated that in a world of ambition, scrutiny, and danger, the unseen hand was often the most formidable force. Brighton Beach was quiet, but the silence carried a weight heavier than the Atlantic fog that rolled in from the pier. 4 months, Vyacheslav Ivankov had moved unseen, orchestrating influence with surgical precision, neutralizing rivals without direct confrontation, and manipulating federal attention to his advantage. But even the most disciplined ghost could sense when the storm was approaching its apex. Tonight, the currents of rivalry, law enforcement scrutiny, and unpredictable ambition converged, forming a tightening noose around the city, and Ivankov was at its center. Anatoly, the hammer Morozov, had not recovered from previous disruptions. His faction was restless, demoralized, and frustrated, yet he had grown more dangerous for it. The humiliation of prior failures had sharpened his focus. Morozov was now determined to assert control decisively, and he was prepared to escalate beyond subtle intimidation. His men were armed, aggressive, and operating with reckless confidence, believing brute force could achieve what subtlety had failed to accomplish. They underestimated the ghost from Moscow, and would soon learn the peril of such arrogance. Ivankov, aware of the escalation, prepared meticulously. Over the preceding days he had positioned loyal operatives strategically across the waterfront, warehouses, and key thoroughfares. Communication had been refined to subtle signals and coded messages. Contingencies were mapped for every conceivable move by Morozov's faction and even the unexpected interventions of federal agents. Observation was paramount. Patience was essential. Control had to be exercised invisibly, without provoking premature exposure. That evening, Ivankov surveyed the waterfront from a shadowed balcony, his eyes tracing the movements of rival operatives. Every detail was noted: the number of men, the placement of vehicles, the timing of shipments, the subtle signs of tension within Morozov's faction. He catalogued behavior patterns, micro-expressions, and interactions among subordinates, each a thread in a larger web of influence that he had been weaving for months. The ghost from Moscow was unseen but omnipresent, his authority extending invisibly into every corner of Brighton Beach. As night fell, Morozov's faction made its move. A convoy of vehicles, crates, and armed men advanced along a key route that Ivankov had already mapped thoroughly. The intention was clear: to assert dominance through visible, aggressive action. Ivankov allowed the approach to proceed, his mind running through multiple scenarios. Each step, each hesitation, each small error would be leveraged. His operatives, positioned discreetly, began subtle interventions, redirecting crates, creating minor obstructions, and introducing confusion. The cumulative effect was disorienting, though imperceptible to those outside the network. Federal agents, monitoring from multiple vantage points, were fully engaged. Plainclothes officers tracked movements, recorded license plates and noted interactions, all the while unaware that their attention was being guided by Ivankov's calculated orchestration. Observation itself became a tool. The ghost from Moscow had long understood that surveillance, when anticipated, could be turned into an advantage, feeding perception while masking the true patterns of influence. At the critical juncture, Morozov personally approached the core shipment, intent on confrontation. Ivankov did not step forward immediately. Instead, he observed, letting Morozov expose not only his plan but also his temperament and vulnerabilities. The rival's aggression, though deliberate, revealed impatience and subtle divisions within his command. Ivankov noted every nuance, the shift of weight, the flicker of an eye, the micro-expressions that betrayed doubt and frustration. Each detail informed his next move. With precision, Ivankov signaled his operatives to act. Minor obstacles, slight delays and strategically placed loyalists disrupted Morozov's intended actions. The faction hesitated, uncertainty spreading like fog through their ranks. Ivankov, unseen and silent, maintained absolute control over the environment. His influence was felt without confrontation, dominance was asserted without violence. Morozov's men faltered, their coordination unraveling under the subtle pressure of unseen authority. The confrontation reached its zenith as Ivankov finally revealed his presence, calm, deliberate, and commanding. A single step forward, a measured gaze, and the positioning of a loyal operative communicated authority and inevitability. Morozov, confronted with the invisible yet undeniable force, recognized defeat without any overt threat. Retreat was inevitable. Control had shifted decisively, loyalty had been reinforced, rival ambitions curtailed, and federal scrutiny remained misdirected. The ghost from Moscow had exercised power in its purest, most refined form, silent, strategic, and absolute. In the aftermath, Ivankov consolidated his influence further. Minor operatives were repositioned, alliances reaffirmed, and operational logistics recalibrated. Shipments, communications, and interpersonal networks were reinforced, creating a resilient lattice of control. The city, outwardly unchanged, was now profoundly shaped by his strategic hand. Morozov's faction, demoralized and cautious, recalibrated their ambitions. Federal agents, diverted by layers of misdirection, remained unaware of the true scale of Ivankov's influence. Despite the apparent victory, Ivankov understood that vigilance was imperative. Ambition, greed, and the unpredictability of human behavior ensured that no equilibrium was permanent. Continuous observation, strategic adjustment, and subtle intervention were necessary to maintain control. Every ally, every subordinate, and every rival was a variable to be accounted for. Brighton Beach was a dynamic environment, and mastery required constant calculation. As dawn broke over the Atlantic, the city awoke to the illusion of normalcy. Shipments moved, cafés opened, and residents went about their routines, oblivious to the invisible orchestration governing the undercurrents of their neighborhood. Ivankov, reviewing his ledger, noted successes, minor errors, and opportunities for future consolidation. Every detail, behavioral cues, logistical flows, potential threats, was catalogued with precision. The ghost from Moscow had weathered the tightening noose of rivalry and scrutiny. He had neutralized direct threats, maintained operational invisibility under federal observation, and reinforced the loyalty and efficiency of his network. Brighton Beach was no longer merely a city of opportunity, it was a domain under his silent authority. Influence had been asserted invisibly, decisively, and strategically, demonstrating that the unseen hand often wields the most formidable power. Yet even in triumph, Ivankov knew that the storm was ongoing. Morozov would attempt to regroup, new actors would emerge, and federal agents would continue probing. Continuous vigilance, meticulous planning, and precise execution were essential. Brighton Beach was a living chessboard, and Vyacheslav Ivankov, the ghost from Moscow, remained several moves ahead, orchestrating the currents of influence with unparalleled mastery. The fog over Brighton Beach was thicker than Ivankov had seen in weeks, a dense veil that transformed the familiar boardwalk and piers into a landscape of uncertainty and latent danger. The Atlantic's waves whispered against the pilings, a constant hypnotic rhythm that both masked and mirrored the tension building across the waterfront. Tonight was the culmination of months of strategy, observation, and subtle manipulation. Every calculated move, every unseen intervention, every silent exertion of influence had led to this moment. The final confrontation with Anatoly, the hammer Morozov was imminent, and the stakes had never been higher. Ivankov moved along the narrow alleys behind the warehouses, his coat drawn tight against the chill, eyes scanning, mind cataloging, predicting, calculating. Morozov's faction had regrouped, emboldened by desperation, willing to escalate beyond previous boundaries. The rival's confidence was dangerous but predictable. He relied on boldness and visibility to assert dominance, yet Ivankov had learned to anticipate not just actions, but motivations, fears, and impulses. The ghost from Moscow was patient, disciplined, and unshakably calm, a silent predator in the shadows of Brighton Beach. By late evening, Morozov's men approached a key shipping point under the guise of routine activity, yet with clear intent, to provoke a confrontation and reclaim the initiative. Ivankov allowed the initial approach, observing the precise movements of every operative. Crates were shifted imperceptibly by loyal operatives. Light and shadow were subtly manipulated. Minor obstacles created hesitation. The ripple effect spread through Morozov's ranks. Uncertainty, frustration, and subtle discord. Ivankov's interventions were silent yet decisive. Federal surveillance had intensified to unprecedented levels. Plainclothes agents patrolled and monitored the waterfront, their presence a constant variable in the complex equation. Ivankov had anticipated this escalation, ensuring that all critical maneuvers were obscured through coded communication, staggered schedules, and controlled misdirection. The agents were drawn toward minor events, unaware of the orchestrated strategy unfolding at the heart of the waterfront. Surveillance itself had become a tool of Ivankov's design, reinforcing perception while concealing reality. The confrontation escalated as Morozov personally approached the core shipment. The ghost remained in the shadows, observing as the rival revealed not only his plan but his temperament and vulnerabilities. Subtle signs, tension in shoulders, impatience in gait, flickers of doubt in his eyes, were catalogued by Ivankov in real time. Every micro-expression became a variable in the strategy of influence. Ivankov executed the first wave of decisive interventions. Loyal operatives created obstacles, redirected movement, and reinforced control over critical nodes. Morozov's men faltered, their confidence undermined by imperceptible disruptions. The psychological pressure mounted. Every hesitant glance and misstep compounded the perception of control exercised invisibly by Ivankov. As the confrontation reached its zenith, Ivankov revealed himself deliberately, stepping into the fog with calm authority. A single measured movement, the precise positioning of an operative, a deliberate pause, each element communicated dominance without violence. Morozov, confronted by the inevitability of Ivankov's control, hesitated. His aggression, carefully cultivated, wavered in the face of unseen mastery. The final maneuver was executed with precision. Minor errors and confusion among Morozov's ranks were leveraged into complete operational disruption. Shipments were secured, alliances reinforced, and the rival faction forced to retreat. Not a single shot was fired, yet the outcome was decisive. Ivankov had demonstrated that strategic influence, observation, and timing could achieve what overt confrontation could not. The ghost from Moscow had asserted authority silently, decisively, and absolutely. In the aftermath, Ivankov consolidated control. Operatives were reassigned, alliances strengthened, and logistical networks optimized. Federal agents continued surveillance, yet misdirection and strategic planning ensured that critical operations remained undetected. Brighton Beach, outwardly unchanged, was now profoundly shaped by Ivankov's invisible hand. Rivals had recalibrated, loyalties had been reinforced, and federal scrutiny was engaged in a misdirected chase. Even in victory, Ivankov remained vigilant. Ambition, unpredictability, and the inherent chaos of human behavior ensured that equilibrium was never permanent. Observation, calculation, and subtle intervention were ongoing necessities. Brighton Beach was a dynamic environment, and mastery required constant attention, precision, and patience. The ghost from Moscow understood that dominance was not a moment, but a sustained condition, maintained invisibly and decisively. As the first light of dawn painted the Atlantic gray with streaks of gold, Ivankov walked along the fog-draped boardwalk. Shipments, cafés, and daily routines continued, oblivious to the invisible orchestration that governed their flow. Ivankov's ledger, meticulously maintained, catalogued successes, errors, threats, and opportunities for further consolidation of influence. His presence was everywhere yet unseen. His authority was absolute, silent, and strategic. The collision of Morozov's ambition, federal scrutiny, and Ivankov's meticulous planning had reached its conclusion. Brighton Beach had been shaped decisively, demonstrating the power of patience, observation, and subtle influence. Ivankov had survived Moscow's alleys, outmaneuvered rivals, and navigated federal observation. Now, in a foreign city, he had established dominance not through noise or violence, but through the inevitability of silent, strategic authority. The ghost from Moscow had triumphed. The network was secure, rivals subdued, and surveillance misdirected. Yet the game would continue, new actors would appear, ambition would flare, and vigilance would be required indefinitely. Ivankov's mastery lay in perpetual observation, calculated intervention, and the quiet assertion of authority. Brighton Beach had become his domain, a city subtly, invisibly, and decisively under the influence of Vyacheslav Ivankov. As the sun rose over the Atlantic, the waves reflecting faint streaks of gold, Ivankov paused at the edge of the pier. He had secured his dominance, but he understood that power was not static. Every day, every movement, and every decision would require attention. The ghost from Moscow was not merely surviving. He was shaping the currents of influence, controlling outcomes, and maintaining authority in a landscape fraught with risk, ambition, and uncertainty. And so Brighton Beach moved forward, outwardly calm, unaware that the invisible hand of Vyacheslav Ivankov guided its fate. The ghost had become legend, a presence felt everywhere, yet seen by none. Influence traveled silently, decisions were executed invisibly, and control was absolute. In a city defined by ambition and secrecy, the unseen hand was the ultimate power, and Ivankov had proven that mastery of observation, patience, and subtle intervention could bend even the most chaotic landscape to one's will. Brighton Beach awoke to a calm that seemed ordinary, yet beneath the surface, the currents of influence had been forever altered. Vyacheslav Ivankov, the ghost from Moscow, had moved through the city with the precision of a master strategist, shaping outcomes, neutralizing rivals, and navigating federal scrutiny with unparalleled subtlety. What remained after months of invisible orchestration was more than dominance. It was a network of loyalty, trust, and quiet authority that would endure far beyond any single confrontation. Ivankov's presence had become a paradox. Everywhere yet nowhere, felt by all yet seen by none. He had cultivated relationships with shopkeepers, cafe owners, dock workers, and mid-level operators, creating a lattice of influence that extended across Brighton Beach's critical nodes. Every shipment, every transaction, every subtle gesture reinforced the power he wielded silently. To the casual observer, life continued as normal. To those who had interacted with him, the awareness of an unseen authority created a new order, one defined not by fear or noise but by inevitability. The rival factions, including Morozov's, had been neutralized not through violence but through strategy. Confidence had been eroded, alliances recalibrated, and ambitions tempered. Those who had once sought to challenge Ivankov's authority now deferred subtly, aware that opposition would be both futile and costly. The ghost from Moscow had demonstrated that influence, patience, and meticulous observation could achieve what aggression and overt confrontation never could. Federal scrutiny remained a constant, yet even the FBI had been drawn into a web of perception carefully manipulated by Ivankov. Surveillance had been anticipated and utilized as a tool to reinforce strategy. By guiding attention toward minor events, he ensured that critical operations remained undetected, allowing his influence to extend without exposure. Agents noted activity and patterns, but never grasped the full scope of the orchestration taking place beneath their observation. The ghost moved with invisibility and authority, unseen but undeniably effective. Ivankov's daily routine became a study in discipline and foresight. Early mornings were spent reviewing observations, updating his ledger, and recalibrating strategies. Afternoon hours involved discreet meetings with trusted operatives, subtle adjustments to logistics, and assessments of rival behavior. Nights were reserved for observation, reflection, and anticipation, walking the fog-laden boardwalk, analyzing every movement, every interaction, every potential variable. Even in quiet moments, he remained fully engaged with the intricate network of influence he had built. Over time, Ivankov's influence extended beyond the immediate domain of shipments and minor factions. The culture of Brighton Beach itself began to reflect his subtle hand. Operations became more organized, loyalty became more nuanced, and minor disputes were resolved with efficiency and discretion. The city, outwardly unchanged, had been reshaped into a landscape where the invisible hand of the ghost guided outcomes and influenced behavior. Power was no longer merely visible, It was felt in the patterns of life, the rhythm of interaction, and the subtle cues that dictated decision-making. The legend of the ghost from Moscow grew quietly. Whispers circulated in cafés, along the docks, and in private gatherings. Tales of a man who moved unseen, who could redirect shipments, manage loyalty, and neutralize threats without confrontation, spread like smoke. It was a reputation built not on violence but on inevitability, on the ability to manipulate circumstances and influence outcomes invisibly. Ivankov had become more than a presence. He had become a myth, a measure of strategy and subtle power that others would reference in hushed tones for years to come. Yet for all the legend, Ivankov remained grounded in reality. He understood that influence was dynamic, not static, that vigilance was eternal, and that every variable, rival ambitions, federal observation, human error, required constant attention. Brighton Beach was a living network, one that demanded perpetual observation, adaptation, and intervention. The ghost from Moscow had mastered it, not by overt control, but through the patient, meticulous application of strategy, foresight, and silent authority. Even as months turned into years, Ivankov maintained his influence. The lessons of Moscow, prison cells, alleys, and the ruthless calculus of survival, were applied to the new context of Brighton Beach with elegance and precision. Rivals learned caution, loyalty was reinforced subtly, and federal scrutiny remained a managed variable. The ghost moved through the city like the fog itself, omnipresent, elusive, and inescapable. In reflective moments, Ivankov considered the nature of power and influence. He had survived environments defined by chaos, ambition, and risk. He had navigated rivalries that were violent and unpredictable, and he had maintained authority under constant scrutiny. The methods he employed, observation, patience, subtle intervention, and invisible orchestration, had proven superior to brute force, aggression, or intimidation. Influence exerted silently, strategically, and deliberately was the ultimate form of control. The legacy of Ivankov in Brighton Beach was not written in headlines, nor memorialized in public accolades. It was inscribed in the quiet obedience of operatives, the recalibrated ambitions of rivals, the subtle efficiencies of local operations, and the persistent misdirection of federal observation. It was a legacy of invisible authority, a testament to the power of strategy, foresight, and patience. Those who understood it spoke of him with reverence. Those who opposed it rarely did so without consequence. By the final hours of the chapter, Ivankov stood at the edge of the pier, watching the Atlantic waves glinting in the muted dawn light. The city was waking, oblivious to the orchestration that had governed its rhythms for months. He had secured influence, neutralized threats, and demonstrated that the ghost from Moscow was a force beyond simple perception. His presence was felt everywhere, yet seen by none. Brighton Beach had been reshaped silently, decisively, and irreversibly. The ghost's work was not done, for influence requires constant maintenance. Yet at this moment, Ivankov allowed himself a rare acknowledgement of accomplishment. The currents of power, rivalry, and observation had collided and settled in a balance that favored the unseen hand. The legacy of Vyacheslav Ivankov, the ghost from Moscow, was established, not through noise or violence, but through strategy, foresight, and the quiet application of invisible authority. In the quiet that followed the storm, Brighton Beach continued its rhythms, the fog curling and retreating as the sun rose over the Atlantic. And somewhere in the shadows, the ghost walked, observing, calculating, and ensuring that the currents of influence continued to flow exactly as he had envisioned. For Vyacheslav Ivankov, power was not declared, it was orchestrated, silently and inevitably, leaving a legacy that would endure far beyond the streets, alleys, and piers of Brighton Beach.